And I want to start by talking about the Canadian context. And the Canadian context is very different, of course, from the context in most of the rest of the world for reasons that have to do with our history and with our geography. We also have a reputation around forced migration that looks a little bit like this. What you have an image of here is one of the National Police Force, the RCMP, essentially arresting a family who are coming as asylum seekers across the Canadian border from the United States. And he's smiling and he's holding up the baby. And this is the way we project ourselves as, Canadians. Everybody wants to come to Canada. We're lovely and we're very warm and supportive towards newcomers, including refugees and asylum seekers. So I'm going to challenge that a little bit, but I also want to contextualize our work. Okay, I'm hitting the button and nothing's happening. So could you just move me to the next slide? Well, thank you. There we go. So I think in order to understand the Canadian migration context, there are two important things to think about. The historical part of it is that we are a settler nation, that Canada as we know it now is a colony. It was a colonial nation. We created this country by European settlers coming to Canada and forcibly displacing the people who are already there. So one of the things that we continue to negotiate is thinking about this history of displacement as we talk about immigration and forced displacement. And also the fact that because so many of us have recent history in other countries, there is an ongoing path of immigration into Canada. So for example, in the province of Ontario, 28% of the people in the province were born in another country. And in the city where I live, more than 50% of the population was born in another country. So we are a country that is made up primarily of immigrants who have come within the last 3 generations. The other thing that's really important to focus on is our geography. So if you look at Europe, it's easy to get to Europe from other places. If you look at Canada, we have one land border. It's with the United States. It is 9,000 kilometers long. It is the longest unprotected border in the world. And outside of that border, we're surrounded by 3 very large, very cold oceans. So how do you get to Canada? You don't usually come by boat. And you don't usually come through the United States. Until the Trump era, people were going to the United States, not from the United States. And so people typically arrive in Canada by air on a visa, and then they claim asylum, or they are resettled with permanent residency. So our migration patterns are very different from the migration patterns in most other countries of the world. To give you an idea of what that pattern looks like, the population of Canada is about 33 million people. This is just looking since 2016. And what you see in the top, whoa, what you see in the top line, I told you I could do something dramatic with this. Bear with me, I'm very good with technology. Glad you're here. So we have accepted approximately 250 to 350,000 permanent residents in Canada. Great, can you go back one slide? Thank you. Maybe I'll use the key. Yeah, okay. You think it's safe?
I don't know.
You don't know, yeah. Okay. So we've accepted between 250 and 350,000 new permanent residents as immigrants into Canada every single year since 2016. That number is increasing. Again, the population is 33 million, and that's almost, when you add humanitarian resettlement, we're getting at 400,000 people per year, new permanent residents. On top of that, every year, we have approximately 200,000 to 300,000 temporary migrant workers entering the country. So we have a very large proportion of newcomers, and that means we have a very well-developed immigration system. But also notice that humanitarian arrivals are very small relative to other immigrant arrivals. And so much of the energy in immigration is really focused on voluntary migrants, economic migrants, family migrants, and there isn't that much time and energy put into the resettlement or settlement of asylum seekers and resettled refugees. Okay, I'm going to try this again. Thank you. Okay. I do want to just quickly note that one of the things that Canada is known for is that we have a long-standing private resettlement program. Approximately half of refugees come into Canada through refugee sponsorship, and the other half come into Canada. I'm just going to stand and wave my hands. Maybe that will help. And then the other half come in through asylum seeking programs. Approximately half of asylum seekers are accepted, so about double the number of people that you see here are the number of people arriving. What people pay attention to is that we have this government-assisted refugee program where individuals who are selected for resettlement by the visa officers in a country of asylum are brought to Canada as permanent residents. They get 1 year of financial assistance and 1 year of settlement support that's provided by the government and by a service providing organization with a contract with the government. This second bar represents privately sponsored refugees. Canada has been sponsoring private refugees since the end of the 1970s. So we have a long history of doing this. And what happens with private sponsorship is that private citizens can come together and bring a refugee to Canada, provide their financial support for 1 year and their resettlement support for 1 year. This can be groups of citizens, it can be faith-based organizations, it can be community organizations. Basically, they're not governmental organizations. And then we have this third program, and this third program is a mixture of the two. So in the third program, private citizens are providing the settlement support, but the financial support is divided between the government and the private citizens. When people talk about the Canadian private sponsorship model, and when the government of Canada gets up and says, you need to do private sponsorship the way we do private sponsorship, what they're actually talking about is this model. Because the difference between blended visa and private sponsorship is that in private sponsorship, you can actually choose who can come, which means they still have to be eligible to meet the criteria of a refugee. So they have to be recognized by the UNHCR and meet the Canadian requirements, but you can select that individual to bring them here. So prior to the Syrian initiative, about 90 to 95% of privately sponsored refugees were coming to join family members. It was actually really a family reunification program. With blended visa, it's a stranger who is being sponsored. The visa officer decides who comes to Canada, and then the private individuals provide that support. And you will notice that there is nowhere near as much interest in the blended visa program as there is in the private sponsorship program. And that's something to keep in mind because the characteristics of the people who migrate through private sponsorship tend to be different from the characteristics of people who come through the blended visa program. Those who come through private sponsorship tend to have more education, they have family members in the country, they are more likely to speak English and French. And so when we talk about their outcomes being better, their outcomes can be better because they simply are a different population than those coming through the blended visa program. I'm not moving around to make you crazy with the camera. I'm just, I just wanted to point out one other thing here, which is that, again, you'll notice that we have very low levels, really, of asylum seekers for the geography reasons that I have described until we get to 2021. So what happens in 2021? The reason I want to talk about this briefly is that this is a current issue happening in Canada now. We have this surge in refugee claimants or asylum seekers coming across the border in fact, from the United States to Canada. There is an agreement between Canada and the United States called the Safe Third Country Agreement that says that you have to claim asylum in the first safe country that you arrive in. Canada and the United States are safe. And therefore, if you're crossing from the United States to Canada or vice versa, you are already in a safe country, you are going to be turned back. So this agreement says you can turn people back at the border if they're crossing the land border between Canada and the United States. But there was a loophole. People realized that for some reason, the way the law was written was that you would only be turned back if you were crossing at a formal or a regular border crossing. Remember the 9,000 kilometers of border? Much of that is not actually defended or protected in any way, but much of it looks like that. You're in the middle of fields or forests, it's remote, it's rural, and crossing at one of those points, if you cross, you are arrested. But when you are arrested, you can then claim refugee status. So it turns out that there was a way to get into Canada as an asylum seeker by crossing a border through an irregular crossing. We had a lot of cases, compared to what happens in Europe, small, but we had a large number of relative cases of individuals trying to cross, dying of frostbite, or dying of hypothermia, losing limbs to frostbite. And when the RCMP were engaged in this kind of response, it was mostly a search and rescue response for people who were in these circumstances. What happened in 2021 is they realized that there was a road that ran from New York City into, from New York State into Quebec, the province of Quebec. The road had been shut, but the road was still there. And in 2021, people began to say, you know what, there's a road that you can take to get into Canada. And people were renting taxis, not-for-profit agencies were renting vans and buses, and they were bringing asylum seekers to the border, which is here. And as you can see, on the other side of the border, on the road, are the RCMP. And the RCMP just waited on the other side of the border. People crossed the border, they arrested them, and they took them to shelters and they applied for asylum. About 90% of asylum seekers in 2021 came into Canada through Roxham Road. And you can see there was a surge as people began sharing information about that. So that explains what we saw there. I also just want to say briefly that we do have now a special policy for Ukrainian refugees. Now, they are not considered refugees. They are coming in under a temporary visa. We have had almost 1 million applications for this visa. We have accepted or approved over 665,000 of those applications, but only 148,000 people have arrived. Again, geography. You can't move easily back and forth from Canada to Ukraine. It's expensive to get here, there. When you arrive in Canada under this visa, you can stay for 3 years, you can work, you have access to healthcare. There's no longer a shelter system. You have to figure out for yourself where you're going to stay, and you get $3,000 and then you're on your own. So people have been finding it quite difficult to make this transition. Okay, that's the Canadian context. It was a bit long, but it's very different from what it is in most European countries. I now want to turn to speak a little bit about refugee policy, and then I will turn to the rest of this talk. And I'm going to say something that is not new or obvious to anyone, which is that refugee policies are becoming increasingly restrictive. And those policies tend to focus on 2 different domains. One is entry into the country. So that's both policies related to accessing the asylum process and policies related to processing asylum claims. And these have been getting increasingly restrictive over the last 20 years. And the other are the welfare policies for people once they're in the country. So this is the number of restrictions on where you can live, whether you can work, but also restrictions on what kinds of entitlements you have while you're in asylum. So how much money you might receive, your access to education, and other phenomena like that. Language classes, whether you have access to language classes. I would like to point out that changes in those asylum policies do not have a large impact on the number of people claiming asylum. This is a study that was done by Hatton, who looked at pairs of countries, so sending country to country of asylum claim, and compared all the possible combinations to look at whether changes in asylum policy had an impact on the number of people making claims based on country of origin. And what he found was it does have some effect. I've included the beta values of his regressions here. But the real factors that are driving asylum seeking claims are the push factors in the country of origin. The biggest predictors of the numbers of people coming into the country are increases in political terror or the rates of political terror, decreasing civil liberties, decreasing economic conditions. And if you look at the pull factors, the economic circumstances of the country and how those change doesn't seem to have an impact. And if you look at restrictive policy, it has some impact, but it only explains about 20% of changes in asylum claims. So we're creating these increasingly restrictive policies. They're having a relatively small effect on whether or not people stay. And the effect of welfare policies is almost negligible. And in fact, it's in the opposite direction. So reducing the welfare support to asylum seekers is not actually having an impact on whether or not people come. So while we're making all of these changes, they're not having the kind of impacts that people claim that they're making them for, but they do have political impacts. So they do allow the government to claim that they're doing something about immigration. They are supported by anti-immigration groups. And so in many cases, we can think of these as being more political rather than outcome-based policies. But they do have a fairly powerful impact on other aspects of the experience for asylum seekers and for resettled refugees. One thing that we know is that the stricter your asylum programs are, the greater the increase in mortality rates. So this is looking at increasing restrictions on search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. This is the number of people arriving when there was a high search and rescue, so people were being rescued. There was a decrease in search and rescue operations, but we still saw an increase in the number of people arriving. Under the third form, which is the Triton 2, they increased search and rescue. It didn't change the number of people who were traveling those routes. But what it did have an impact on is the number of people who died. So yes, the policies are having an impact. The impact is on people's survival, but it's not having a huge impact on the number of people coming. So another example or another way of thinking about the impact of more restrictive policies. The other way in which policies have an impact on newcomers is in terms of what we're calling general health and well-being. And what we have been doing in our research is using health as an outcome measure to look at the success of integration and settlement policies for reasons having to do with the social determinants of health. And that's where I want to turn the conversation now. Canada is not only known for having a large number of immigrants, but we are also known for something called the healthy immigrant effect. When immigrants arrive in Canada, their physical and mental health is better than that of the average Canadian. So they're actually healthier than the Canadians in the country that they arrive in. And then their health gets worse. So moving to Canada will make your health worse, according to this research. And the question is, why are their health outcomes getting worse? We know why their health is better when they arrive. Canada actively excludes families who have any kind of health condition that might be seen as a burden on the healthcare system. So if you have a disability or a chronic disease, you will probably not be allowed to immigrate to Canada unless you come through a humanitarian pathway. We also know that people are unlikely to migrate if they are not in good health. They're not in good status. People tend to migrate when they're in relatively good health. So why is their health decreasing? Some have argued that it's because they're just regressing to the mean. Some have argued that they move to Canada and they pick up all of our very unhealthy health habits. So it's our unhealthy behaviors that are making people sick. But if you look at what kinds of conditions are changing over time, they are the health conditions that are associated with stress and poverty, disability, coronary heart disease. That's not proof of anything, but it's indicative that you might want to look at the conditions that might be associated with this declining health condition. The other thing is that the amount of deterioration differs by which group you're looking at. Those groups in Canada who are most likely to experience social exclusion are those groups that show the greatest decline in their health and well-being. Once again, suggesting that we're talking about health equity and we're talking about inequitable conditions following migration. The social determinants of health argues that you can understand the impact of social status on health by considering that those people with higher social status have more power. They have the ability to control resources more effectively, and so they have access to better work, better home conditions, and they have better social interactions in as much as they have more power in their social interactions with others. We know that work and home conditions have a direct impact on your health and well-being. So if you are living in a situation where you are exposed to a lot of pollution, where you are being forced to work in conditions where you do shift work, or where you have to work 2 jobs, or where you're working in conditions that are difficult, physically harmful, obviously that's going to have a direct impact on your physical health, and it will increase mortality rates. We also know that work and home conditions change health-related behaviors. If you're working 2 jobs, you're probably not finding time to exercise. If you're living in an area that's not safe, you're probably not spending a lot of time outside or exercising. If there is no affordable food, then you are not eating a healthy diet. So health-related behaviors, of course, are also related to social conditions and also related to increased morbidity, increased mortality, decreased well-being. But the other pathway for these conditions is through psychological factors. So we know that poor work and home conditions also increase levels of stress and decrease feelings of control. That has some impact on health behaviors, but it also has a direct impact on one's physiological regulation. So we see dysregulation of the immune system, the cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, even epigenetic changes as a result of stress. And not only is that being affected by the material conditions of your life, but it's also being affected by the social conditions of your life. We know that even when material conditions are similar, people who are in lower status positions also experience more stress and more distress, and also get sicker and die younger. And again, it's assumed that this is through the pathways of stress and loss of control or low control. So those are the mechanisms of the social determinants of health. And here's why we find it useful. Because the models of the social determinants of health also argue that it's not enough to just say, okay, social status matters. You have to ask where the social status is coming from. And this is the piece that is often missing in integration research, and in fact, often not researched in social determinants of health research, that the social and socioeconomic and political context determines which groups have which status, and therefore determines which groups are able to access better education, better jobs, better income. And they also determine the kinds of relationships between groups in terms of which groups are discriminated against, how much social capital groups have, and how groups interact with one another. So the reason that we like to work within the social determinants of health model is that it explicitly argues that you need to think upstream about why you're getting inequities in outcomes for different groups in society. Okay, we know that refugees, when they arrive in a country of asylum or are resettled, are coming from a situation with very negative social determinants of health. So one of the questions you can ask is, are you going to see a healthy refugee effect that parallels what we've seen with immigrants? What do you think? Do you think that refugees' health is going to improve following migration? Or how many people think it will get better following migration? I mean, think about where they're coming from. And think about where it's a trick question, right? Because you think I'm not going to be asking you this question unless the answer is no, it doesn't, right? Yeah, you're right, it doesn't. Through numerous studies, we have found that the longer refugees stay in Canada, the worse their health gets. And this, for us, challenges us around what are we doing to refugees once they arrive in Canada, that their health is worse the longer they are here. I'm going to show you just a couple of quick data points to reflect on this. This is a cross-sectional study that was done with government-assisted refugees. So they had this is at one point in time, but they've been in Canada from anywhere from 0 to 6 years. The longer they've been in Canada, the worse their health outcomes. This is self-rated health, physical health, mental health. We've also done this longitudinally. This is with a national study that we did with Syrian refugees. And again, we're asking them to rate their health and their physical health and their mental health. The effect is not as strong. Note that they're not rating their health as being particularly good. But when we use more complex measures of health, they rate their health initially as being approximately on par with the average self-rated health of the average American, not Canadian, but American. We don't have standardized data for the Americans. But particularly among the men, we're starting to see a slight decrease over time. And when we look with more closely, I'm going to look just at mental health here. This is depression. If you look at what's happening with mental health over time, about 14% of the people in our sample of the originally 1,900 people, 14% reported clinical levels of depression in wave 1. They've been in Canada for 1 to 2 years. By wave 2, that was 18%. And it's increasing across the 4 years. Why are we seeing an increase in mental health issues? It depends on the person. This is an intersectional question. But one of the things that we wanted to look at was particularly among the men, and particularly among the men with fairly high levels of education, we know that they tend to have poorer mental health outcomes than other refugee groups. And we had a pretty good idea from the research we have done, qualitative research that we've done around why that might be. So we wanted to test this with quantitative research. So we looked at Syrian newcomer men by education, university educated versus those who had approximately a high school or trade education versus those who had primary school education. If you had a higher level of education, you were more likely to be employed. Great. Your income was no higher with a university education than it was if you had a grade 6 education. So yes, they'll hire you, but you're being hired into jobs that are being paid minimum wage. And the extent to which you're satisfied with your job was in fact predicted by your education level. People with higher levels of education were less satisfied with their jobs. Everybody was dissatisfied with their salary, but both salary and education predicted your job satisfaction. And then if you try to look at perceived control and stress, once you take job satisfaction into account, perceived control and stress are determined by your job satisfaction. So one of the reasons that we were seeing increasing depression among particularly the men in our sample, and I'm going to return to why we think it's just the men, is because they were unable to find work that is commensurate with their previous history, their education, their experience, or their expectations. And our interviewers, who are all themselves members of the Syrian newcomer communities, said that by about year 3, people are pretty settled, but they're losing hope. They're beginning to realize that they will never have the career that they had. They will never have the life that they have, and they will never have the social position that they have. And coming to terms with that is an extremely painful experience. Now, a lot of the things I've been talking about in the context of social determinants of health are exactly the same kinds of things we talk about when we talk about integration. Participation in society, inclusion, housing, employment. And I want to now move from talking about social determinants of health to talking about those integration factors that we think are in fact predicting people's health and well-being. And before I do that, I want to acknowledge that people hate the term integration. It's a highly contested term. I agree with the criticisms that people have about integration. So I just want to take a moment to talk about why I still talk about integration. There are three areas in which people debate the definition of integration. One of them is that people debate what we should be looking at when we talk about integration. So some people argue we should be talking about social integration, shared values, or some kind of shared lifestyles. Particularly those people who emphasize social integration, they rarely are really able to articulate what they mean by social integration. It's really hard to identify exactly which values they're talking about. And they tend to be talking about integration into this social imaginary where this society, everybody shares the same values and the values never change. So everybody in Poland believes the same thing, and you've believed the same things for the last 20 years. Of course, that's not true. So the comparison or the discussion around social integration is complicated and underdefined. The other category that people talk about is material integration, which is a focus on usually labor engagement. So are people employed? And sometimes also language. Those are the two things people tend to focus on. And the third one is whether you have an emotional attachment to the new country that you have moved to. Do you feel like you're Polish? Do you feel like you're Canadian? Do you identify with being a Pole or a Canadian? The second dimension that people debate is the intersectionality dimension. So, okay, there's multiple possible ways we can talk about integration, and there's multiple possible integration outcomes. Should they all be considered equally? Often people are asking about integration because they want to ask about whether integration was successful. Well, who decides if integration is successful? What the state considers to be successful integration is often employment and language. What individuals consider as integration will depend on a number of other factors. Among our Syrian sample, mothers of young children did not want to be working. They wanted to be at home with their children because they had young children. And for them, successful integration was being able to be at home to raise their children. When we work with families where we have individuals who have a chronic disability or a chronic illness, then there's often one person, the person who speaks English the best or French the best, depending on where they are, who has to facilitate that person's access to the healthcare system. And so if you look at that individual and you say, well, they're not really integrating because they're not going to school and they're not working, that's because they're spending all of their time taking a family member to unpredictable medical appointments. Or they make a decision that they will go to work so that somebody else in the family can go to school. And the family unit says, we're integrating well because we are all doing different things to make sure that members of the family can access what they need. So you have to think about the larger picture of whose integration matters, why does it matter, and who gets to decide what a successful integration outcome is. And the third one, and this is perhaps the one that is the most contested, is that people talk a lot about two-way integration. The European Union talks about two-way integration. They define integration as a two-way process. They say integration is where newcomers change to be closer to the society they've moved to, and society changes to reflect the fact that it's now made up of different people. But in reality, when most people measure or look at integration, they only look at changes on the parts of the newcomer. They don't look at how the community or the society has changed to reflect who now makes up that community or that society. So when people critique integration, they're usually bringing in one of these critiques, and often this one down here, and they say we should use a different term like inclusion. My concern is that you use a different term and you end up with the same problems. People are still only looking at changes on the part of the newcomers themselves. So we've been trying to say, how about when you get people to measure integration or do work on integration, you try to work with models that force them to think about all of these different levels. So the middle level here are the measures that we usually look at. These are the functional measures that Ager and Strang use: housing, education, employment, healthcare access, comfort with the culture and the language. But we also have psychological, emotional factors, your sense of belonging and safety and security. And we also have social factors, your ability to form social connections with people within your community and with people in other communities, so social bonds and social bridges. We have community welcome, which reflects the extent to which you experience discrimination or negative attitudes on the part of the community. And we have institutional adaptation. And this is the extent to which the institutions you have to interact with recognize and accommodate the characteristics of refugees that are unique. Do they provide language interpretation? Do they recognize the documents that you have or have alternative documents that you can use because you've had to leave them behind? Do they acknowledge that family size may be different? So what are the ways in which the institutions are accommodating newcomers? All right, I am coming back to policy. So those restrictive refugee policies are intended to have an effect on material conditions. They are intended to limit your housing. They intentionally limit your access to employment. And they intentionally limit your income. So yes, restrictive policies have a direct relationship with that material level of integration. But one of the things that we're also trying to argue is that you need to consider that these levels are all interconnected. So when you start restricting people at this middle level here of material, if you like, integration outcomes, you are having an impact on other aspects of integration. And there is a fairly large, actually not that large, body of research that shows that what's happening at that material level has implications for all of these other levels of integration. So for example, research done in the Netherlands has shown that the longer refugees or asylum seekers spend in the asylum process and spend in shelters, the longer it takes, or the lower employment rates they have. So the longer you spend in asylum, the harder it is for you to find employment. The longer you spend in housing where you are segregated from other people in the society, the harder it is for you to actually start making relationships outside of your own social groups. We also know that things like inadequate income, unemployment, or poor housing are associated with social stigma. So if we create a condition where refugees cannot work, are living in poverty, we're also forcing them into stigmatized identities that can further harm their the attitudes in the community towards them. I now want to talk a little bit about these other levels of integration and the direct impacts of refugee policies on these other levels. I want to start with this lower level here, which is the psychological level of sense of belonging and security. These two are very tightly connected to one another. So when we talk about sense of belonging has been defined in a variety of different ways. It's feeling that you are valued and accepted. So you can see right away that there's a connection between community attitudes. It's feeling connected through shared experiences and feelings. It's feeling shared identity, feeling supported, or feeling that you can choose whether or not you can belong. Feelings of security are related to the security of your status. So we know that people who are in temporary visa status tend to have high levels of anxiety and distress relative to those with permanent status. Trust in the police and the judiciary. We know that that trust is also related to feeling like you are being treated fairly by the police and fairly by the systems, the political systems you're a part of. So if you know that your rights are being restricted because you're not allowed to leave your residence, for example, you are already building mistrust in the system. And financial security. I'm going to come back to our Syrian newcomers. This is year 1 compared to year 4, and we're asking them their sense of belonging to their neighborhood, their city, and to the country, to Canada. And they have increasing sense of belonging over time, which is good. They actually start off relatively high. which is also pretty good. I also want to point out that year 4, this is the beginning of the COVID epidemic. So they're rating themselves relatively highly on belonging to Canada, but in our qualitative interviews, they also talk about how much they appreciated the various financial benefits that Canada provided during the beginning of COVID. So there may have been factors that actually also facilitated their trust in the system and their feeling of belonging and being valued. When we looked at what predicted belonging, this is just a quick regression analysis, and I'm only showing those variables that predicted belonging. These are not strong effects, these are beta values. Gender, there was no difference overall. There was a bit of a difference in terms of government sponsorship, but I want to be careful about interpreting that because there were, in the province of Quebec, where there were a lot of issues around belonging, they were almost all privately sponsored in the city where we worked because they distributed the government assisted to other regions. So government-sponsored refugees reported higher levels of belonging to their city and to the country, but again, I would be careful about interpreting that. Age, as people get older, they tended to report slightly higher belonging to the country, a tiny bit more to the neighborhood. Language didn't have an effect, although you would have thought it would. Employment didn't have an effect, even though in our qualitative data, it comes up all the time, but only for men and not for women. Having trouble for paying for your basic needs. So poverty, the higher, the more likely you were, or the more frequently you had trouble paying for your needs, the lower your sense of belonging to your neighborhood. The more barriers you had in accessing services the previous year, the lower your sense of belonging to your immediate community. And then, do you think that you're valued? Do Canadians typically treat you with respect? We asked them that question the year before, and it predicted the extent to which they reported feeling that they belonged in Canada. Experiences of discrimination, people rarely reported that, so that didn't really come out. And I'd like to draw your attention to these two things. We asked them how close they were to friends from their own community and friends in other communities. And what we found was that it was actually closeness to co-ethnic friends that was the strongest predictor across those 3 measures of belonging. So again, there people often talk about concerns that people are only building friendships with people from their own community, and yet that still brings a sense of attachment, emotional attachment to the country that they're living in. But closeness to friends from other communities does predict attachment to the country. Okay, last 3 points. I just want to pull these 3 apart separately. Social connections. Policies that hinder people's ability to make relationships or to build relationships because of all the patterns that we have seen are problematic in terms of integration outcomes. And those are policies that limit your language access to language classes. For example, classes have waiting lists. Classes are not available except through taking long trips to reach them. There's no childcare available. So these are all factors that limit access to classes and that can have intersectional effects. Segregated housing, I've already mentioned. Policies that facilitate social connections, opportunities for high quality interactions. It's not just interacting with people from other communities, but interacting in a way that facilitates recognizing each other's agency, that facilitates respect, and that doesn't reinforce hierarchies or power differences. A lot of the ways that people interact with newcomer communities is often through a charitable frame, and that charitable framing reinforces an unequal relationship. So thinking about how you can create more egalitarian relationships is really important. Collaborating between groups to plan how the groups are going to share resources, whether that's neighborhood spaces, whether that's buildings, and then opportunities for employment. This is a really great comment from a youth in a focus group that we did in a Pan-Ontario study, who really talks about how all these things are interconnected. It says you need to go through education, and of course through school, you get connected to the community. You get to know the different cultures because at school you meet many different people and you make friends and you feel more comfortable in the community where you're living. So he clearly draws this connection between education, acculturation, language, social connections, and sense of belonging. Community welcome. These are attitudes towards newcomers. Policies that foster negative attitudes hinder the entire integration process. If you have highly discriminatory attitudes, then you are less likely to be able to access housing, less likely to be able to access employment, less likely to be able to make friends across communities. And policies or processes that are dehumanizing generate negative public attitudes. One of the ways that we dehumanize migrants is by treating immigration as a criminal act. If you criminalize immigrants, you are dehumanizing immigrants, you are creating negative attitudes and negative discourse around newcomers. The other issue is crisis framing. If you're always talking about migration as a crisis, the refugee crisis, you are once again dehumanizing individual experiences and generating negative attitudes and a panic morality, a panic response. Policies that facilitate community welcome, again, supporting employment so that people are not seen as a burden on society, although sometimes they're seen as competing for employment, so it can work both ways, and increasing community consultation and involvement. So one of the reasons people are attracted to community sponsorship is it's a way to engage the community in refugee processes. And I just want to come back to Roxham Road. So Canada and the United States on March 23rd decided they're going to close the loophole so that people now can be turned back anywhere when they cross the border anywhere in Canada. And they put that into practice 24 hours later. So that's no longer an option. And the way that people talked about that loophole and the way that people talked about the people who were coming in through Roxham Road was in terms of the burden. So the immigration departments paid $93 million for leases from hotels in Quebec to house these individuals. So creating this discourse of burden around asylum seekers. And this is the Premier of Quebec, Legault, saying that people crossing Roxham Road are bogus refugees, which was the way we talk about refugees, deserving refugees, non-deserving refugees, and they're eventually going to be ordered to leave Canada. Again, in fact, about half of them get asylum. And lastly, I want to talk about institutional adaptation. So policies that make it harder for institutions to meet the needs of newcomers. So one of them is not giving organizations the resources or the time to be able to prepare for what's needed. When that happens, the people working in those settings do not have the time and do not want to actually accommodate the newcomers. The newcomers become a source of stress for the providers rather than individuals that they need to accommodate. We see that in our healthcare system, where if healthcare providers don't have enough time to deal with challenging issues, then they resent people who come in with challenging issues and they don't accommodate them. A lack of funding that is needed in order to deal with what might be unique needs among refugees. Policies that facilitate institutional adaptation include giving the staff the time to actually make the accommodations that are required and the amount of time that they have working with the clients, but also giving people resources and training so that they feel confident in whatever changes they need to do, whether that's working with interpreters, whether that's working with families from different cultural communities. So in the context of what was happening with the asylum seekers in Canada, they decided they would put a bunch of people on a bus and they shipped a few thousand people to a tiny town of 50,000 people with no warning to the mayor, so that the town had no time to prepare or respond. And when the news agency contacted the mayor, he said he was flabbergasted when he received the numbers from Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada for the first time this week that indicated how many people had already come to the city. So he hadn't even been told how many people had been brought, and they were already there. We have that problem with health insurance for asylum seekers as well, which is that it's a different insurance system, and people who use that insurance system, hospitals and doctors, it takes longer to be reimbursed. So people don't want to accept the interim federal health insurance, and so people who have health insurance can be turned away because providers don't accept their insurance policies. They only accept provincial insurance. So why are we using a social determinants of health lens? Let me come back to that very first question. What we like about bringing a social determinants of health framing to thinking about integration is that a social determinants of health lens is, first of all, inherently focused on equity. So it looks at the ways, the access to resources and the experiences that people are having living in a new country, not from a charity framework where we should be grateful that they're getting anything, but rather from an equity perspective that says, why are some people in these communities getting less access than others? The second is that it always, at least implicitly, but usually explicitly, asks the question of what are the policies or the conditions that are creating these inequities? So it asks you to look beyond the circumstances to think about how the policies have shaped those circumstances for different groups. It clearly makes associations between the different levels. It's starting other ways that people represent the social determinants of health looks like the socio-ecological model. It recognizes that individuals are nested in families, in communities, in countries, and in various policy and socioeconomic networks. And it recognizes that you need to look at community level phenomena, not just at the outcomes for individuals. Thank you very much for your patience and for letting me talk to you today and figure out this technology. If you have any questions, I'm happy to be emailed.